We don't want you to bring the plan to us. We'd like to share in the plan. And when we get over that, well, then maybe we can give right to Bill.
Look, let's not make any mistake about it. It's more than a two-way street on it. It's, there isn't any question when you go back on it, if you have any idea, if you've had any experience of what whites have done to blacks, it is almost a miraculous wonder that every black isn't filled with a homicidal desire to kill every white that comes around the corner. I'm serious about that. It's impossible for us to even begin to appreciate it, to realize it, any more than it is to realize what it was like under the Nazis in that scene. It just becomes words. Even I can remember the first time I came to Minneapolis, the man who really organized the Packing House Workers Union of the United States was a big, militant black by the name of Hank Johnson, who was Assistant National Director of the United Packing House Workers Organizing Committee. One of my closest friends got murdered in the process of doing this. And I could never understand why he and the other black organizers were always driving Nash Ramblers. That's American, it was what subsequently became American Motors. And then I found out when we went to Minneapolis. I found out when we drove and drove, we couldn't get a motel room any place between Chicago and Minneapolis. Then we would do this business where I'd walk in and I'd register, and Hank would wait down in the car with the lights off, and then I'd come back in the car and we'd go back to our motel unit, which I now had the keys to. We'd get into the motel unit. 10 minutes later, the phone would ring. It was the motel owner. This unit had been previously reserved. He was terribly sorry and so forth. We got tossed out of there. And we wound up sleeping out in the fields. Now, this was why the big selling car in black communities was the Rambler, because it made into a double bed. The seats, I don't know, I don't think do you remember that at all? Do you remember? Now, you have the business of what was, and it's beyond that. Remember I was talking about history before. As recently as 35 years ago, you went down south and you opened your mouth on civil rights. If you were lucky, if you were really lucky, you just got tarred and feathered. If your luck ran halfway out, you were castrated. If your luck went all the way out, you were lynched. There were more than 200 to 300 people lynched every year in the so-called business, the hell, the violence. It was just it was incredible. Most of you find it very difficult to believe. But when you're in the scrap, when you're now turning around society, there isn't any point in going back on it. This is the problem that we're faced with, because all we're doing is hurting ourselves. There's no point when you go ahead and beat the enemy on something and you got them in a situation and you got them ready to move on this, to then go ahead and kick them off so that they go off to the other side, just because their kids did this to you back 20 years ago or so. Go ahead. You mean to read history?
Or to even realize it's important.
To realize it's important? Well, it comes up if you have organizers. Organizers are basically educators and teachers with you. And as you start going over tactics, as you're organizing, and how you're going to fight here and how you're going to fight there, you're going to find that this will be brought up, that'll be brought up, this will be brought up. Even simple things, such as, for example, on a sit-in, well, the sit-ins began. Your first mass sit-in was over at Goodrich Tire, Goodrich Rubber in Akron, Ohio. And the second one was Chevrolet Ford in the automobile workers industry. And one of the things that came up was right after the sit-in began, that in order to keep up one of the things that they had to learn was in order to keep up the morale of the people sitting in so that they'd sit in and hold on to the property, there had to be a moral principle enunciated that they could cling to. For example, when they were sitting in on Chevrolet 4, the papers were screaming, these Reds who were criminals have seized private property which is not theirs. It belongs to General Motors. They're thieves, they're vandals, they're trespassing, they're this and so forth. Lewis, as the organizer, came out then with a statement, quotes, "The right to a man's job transcends the right to private property," unquote. Now, granted, you could pick holes in that thing. But at the moment, it sounded very good. And to all the men in Chevrolet 4, immediately they cheered and said, yeah, our right to a job here transcends the right of General Motors to own this thing, and we're going to sit here until hell freezes over. And they sat there and they won, you know. Now, these are the kinds of things, as you're talking in terms of tactics, you bring up and say, well, now, wait a minute, if we're going to do this, we've got to have a moral commitment of some kind, at least a saying, something for our people to hang on to, you know. You're always moving it in, historical things, with what is extremely relevant right now, and in terms of how important it is, or let us not make the mistake they made over here. They were doing just what we're doing, but they left the back door open and they got clobbered over here. We can't afford to do that. It's always being brought up with something that you're studying, you're examining, you're moving on. Now, it is not, quote, a seminar in history. Never.
Why do you chastise the SDS then? Why do you chastise the kids for taking over a dean's office? For protesting?
Because it's...
This is historically the way that it's not about. The labor movement has used sit-ins, has used violence. The black people in the ghettos, their plight would not have been known had not they burned the building. Then why have you chastised the kids?
In the first place, I'm not chastising the kids. I made a statement of what the kids on campuses today are saying in terms of their approach. And in terms of their approach, I would say that what they're doing is infinitely more realistic. And in terms of what they're getting, when you get kids sitting at the University of Wisconsin and saying that the power is not up in that president's office, the power is down the street in the state capitol building with those legislators who vote on the budget of what this university gets or doesn't get, and those legislators come out of my county, out of his county, 70 to 80%, I think it's 73% of the students at the University of Wisconsin are from the state of Wisconsin. And in going back to organize in their own congressional districts and start putting the heat on their people, their legislators, that is where you'll get the action going, rather than seizing these buildings. What do you think the seizing of the buildings at Columbia did? You read the papers. It becomes sort of an infantile operation. It does not, don't equate seizing of a classroom building with the full stoppage of Chevrolet 4 and General Motors. Don't put those two things together any more than at my school.